Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have our wonderful presenter back with us again. He was with us in October for the Haunted History of New England, and now he's back to do his presentation, No Irish Need Apply, the Irish in Boston. So I thank you, Chris, for joining us. I'm going to
Thank
hand
you.
this over to you now, and I hope everyone enjoys the presentation.
Thank you, Liz. As you folks know, this is a 90-minute presentation, so I'm not going to waste time. I'll get right down to it. And let's look at our first slide here. So, contrary to common belief, the Irish were not the first in Boston. It was the Puritans. Now, a lot of people, I don't think a lot of people know why they were called the Puritans. I know when I went to school, I got the short and dirty when I was in high school. Basically, they were from England. They came here seeking religious freedom, and that was about it. I didn't really get the whole story. It was much later when I learned the in-depth story about the Puritans. Here's the short story. Basically, if you want to find out who the Puritans are, you have to go back to this guy. He's somebody that is highly recognizable. This is Henry VIII, who, believe it or not, was a staunch Catholic until he wanted to get an annulment. And then he went to the Pope and he asked for the annulment, and the Pope said no. So Henry had a little hissy fit, and he decided to pull the entire Catholic Church away from the Roman Catholic Church in England and create the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Now, if you were to walk into an Anglican church today, and you're familiar with a Catholic church, you might say, this looks exactly like a Catholic church, because there wasn't really much difference. There, you can see the crosses, the stained glass, the gold chalices, the incense, everything. The only thing that was different was pretty much you could get a divorce, and Henry VIII was the head of the church and later royalty as well. Now, this is where the Puritans come in. They followed this man. This was John Calvin, and he was a Protestant reformer. Now, the Protestant Reformation started with Martin Luther way back in the 1500s. Now, there were different movements breaking away from the Catholic Church, and Calvin's theology was a little bit different. He believed that Christians should go back to the original Bible and not depend on conclaves and popes and all these different things that have happened over the years. He believed that you should not go and do anything unless it's expressly written in the Bible. This is why they never celebrated Christmas, because it's not in the Bible that Jesus was born on the 25th of December. Anyway, in England, you had a group of people that followed Calvin, and they became known as the Puritans because they were Anglicans and they wanted to purify the Anglican Church. They wanted to remove everything that smacked of Catholicism. They wanted bare bones. They wanted to go back to the basics, like those first century Christians that Calvin was always talking about. To give you a contrast here, this is a former Puritan church in Hingham. This is the Ship's Church in Hingham. You don't see any statues, no stained glass, no gold chalices. The priests don't have colorful robes. There's no incense. It's back to basics. These were the people that first settled Boston. And they came in 1630, 30 ships of Puritans, and they ended up in Boston, what we call Boston. And they called it their city on the hill. They called it their New Jerusalem. This was a new beginning. They wanted to show people what Christians should be. If it wasn't in the Bible, you didn't do it. And this is where they settled. Doesn't look much like it does today, but this was called Shawmut by the Native Americans. And at high tide, it flooded, and it was an island, not a peninsula. And this is where their city on the hill would be. And this is probably what it looked like if you were standing smack dab in the middle of town in the town square, which is today State Street, and you were facing towards the State House, Beacon Hill, which you wouldn't be able to see today because of all the gigantic buildings. If you were to go back 400 years ago, nearly 400 years ago, and stand in that place, look towards the State House, this would be your view. Up in the distance there, you see the beacon from Beacon Hill, and the church and the buildings there were the center of town. That was the center of Boston. This is going to be their city on the hill. And it was here that the first Irish came, not long after those first Puritans. Now, unlike the Puritans, they did not come of their own volition. They did not come willingly. They came as so-called indentured servants. Now, here's another thing I learned in high school, that the simple definition, indentured servant. Indentured servant was somebody, I thought, that willingly wanted to come to America and made contact with somebody that was already here. Somebody that was of means that could finance their trip over. And when they did that, they made a contract, an indenture contract, that to get over here, to have that passage paid to get over to America, you agreed to work for this person from a period of 5 to 7 years. Hopefully you'd learn a trade, and at the end of those 7 years, you were a free man. Now, this is a little bit different because these people were not here because they wanted to be. They were brought here, but they've been given the term indentured servants. How did this all come about? It came about because of this man. This is Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England. Well, the aforementioned Puritans went to war with the Royalists, the Anglicans, and the Puritans won the war. And they took control of the British government and executed the king. King Charles I was beheaded, and this man, Oliver Cromwell, was put in charge. Instead of taking a royal title, he chose to take the title Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. Now, before this, he was the leader of the New Model Army, the army that smashed the Royalists, the Anglicans. And it was a powerful army. When they took control of England, as he was seated as the Lord Protector, he started hearing murmuring coming over from Ireland, which had been under British control, going back to William the Conqueror. The British were meddling in Irish affairs. He was hearing murmuring and complaining. Horrible stories started to come across that these Irish were committing atrocities against their English landlords. They were in open revolt. So what did he do? He took his New Model Army and he took it off the field after winning the victory and aimed it towards Ireland to subjugate the Irish, to put down this rebellion. And his first target was the city, the wall, the ancient medieval walled city of Drogheda. And he came, his army surrounded that city, and he demanded of the mayor that they surrender forthwith. And if they didn't, there would be no quarter. And what that means is that if they have to spend lives to get through that wall, they're going to give anybody mercy at all. And this is the number that you're looking at. Now, once they breached that wall after a terrible battle, they went on a murder spree. Now, the number you're looking at is not soldiers. The number you're looking at is civilian casualties due to this no quarter policy. After Drogheda fell, he went on, and the next target was Wexford. It was at Wexford, similar, laid siege to Wexford, and 1,500 killed. Notice the numbers are going down because they heard what he did at Drogheda. And finally, the final nail in the coffin was Waterford. And Ireland was on her knees. And they were once again under the thrall of British control. Now it seems that this did not suit Cromwell enough, because shortly after this, in the 1650s, they call it Cromwell's Reign of Terror. Over 100,000 Irish children were taken from their parents and sold as indentured servants in the West Indies, Virginia, and New England, the British colonies. In addition to that, thousands of men and women were also just abducted and sold as these indentured servants in the Americas. And when they got here, this is probably what it looked like getting off the ships. And here's another image. If you can imagine these Irish being lined up and basically parceled out to different families in the colony. Here's a Puritan looking at them. And you know what the first thing they did? The first thing that most of them did when they hit the ground, they hit the ground running and they ran away. And oddly enough, this is from a few years later. This is what you would call two runaway slave advertisements in a paper. And if you look here, let me blow it up a little bit. It's kind of hard to read. You see that they're on the lookout for a Negro fellow. And down below, they're looking for a runaway Irishman. Now, the Irish and the African Americans actually helped each other run away because they were in the same condition. They were these servants. Now, the Irishman could break away and meld into the population a lot more as long as he didn't open up his mouth and spew that Gaelic all over the place. The African American fellow, much harder for them to escape. This is part of the reason why African Americans eventually it morphed into permanent servitude for the rest of their lives. The Irish always remained indentured servants. The African Americans became just plain slaves. And if you were caught and you were brought back, here are some examples of the punishment that might be meted out to you. Of course, you could spend the day in the pillory or the stocks. And it doesn't look so bad, huh? You might get a tan, just sit out there for the day, and that's it. These illustrations are a little sanitized, because in reality, it really looked more like this image here. This image shows what would really happen to you. Everybody in town would bring all the garbage they could collect, any horse manure off of the street, any offal they found and garbage, anything, just to pelt you with it and harangue you for the entire day. This was pure and utter humiliation. It was meant to teach you a lesson. This was how the Puritans disciplined people, this type of punishment. And for constant offenders, they might get this punishment. This is called being whipped at the cart's tail, where you'd be tied to a cart's tail and dragged through town as everybody took their shot at you. And here in Boston, this is where most of these punishments took place. This, what you're looking at, this wooden structure here, was the old townhouse, kind of like every town had a town hall. This was the old townhouse, and you can see there was a pillory, a whipping post, and this is where these punishments were done. And I think you're probably very familiar with this location if you've been to Boston. Many people come here as tourists just to see this location, but not because it's where the townhouse is or where the Irish were punished or any other ne'er-do-wells. This is the location today. Yes, the townhouse burnt down and the old state house was built here. And as you know, this is the location of the Boston Massacre as well. Now, so far up until now, I've been talking about the Catholic Irish, and maybe you've heard of the Scots-Irish. Where did the Scots-Irish come from? I always thought it was just Irish people who like to drink scotch or something. But as I got older, I learned the true facts. And if we look at this period when the Puritans were in power, They had allies up in Scotland. There were folks called Presbyterians who were also followers of John Calvin. So the Presbyterians and the Puritans were very similar theologically, of course. And during the age that the Puritans were in control, they actually began to move into Northern Ireland and try to colonize Northern Ireland. This is why we still have that strife today. We have a large Protestant population in Northern Ireland and the rest of it is Catholic. Now, what happened was after about 10 years, I always say that the English got sick of Cromwell and the Puritans, and eventually they brought back the king. The only problem was the king didn't have a head, so they did the next best thing. They brought back his son, Charles II, and they reinstituted the royal family. Now the Puritans are on the outs and the Anglicans are back in, and they start passing laws against the Puritans. Now the law that was passed in 1704 was called the Sacramental Test Act. And what that did, basically, it said that there could only be Anglican ministers in the British Isles. So the writing on the wall was there for these Scots-Irish and Presbyterians, and many of them from Northern Ireland and Scotland decided to emigrate over to the Americas. And they were actually encouraged by this fellow. This is Cotton Mather. Maybe you know him from Salem witch trial fame. He wrote letters encouraging their brethren in Scotland, these Presbyterians, these Scots-Irish. They've been in Ireland for almost a generation, to come to America, because in America, the Puritans still held sway in New England. The Anglicans didn't have much power over them. So they came over thinking that they'd be welcomed with open arms in Boston. And they found out it wasn't quite that. They found out that once they got to Boston, the Puritans were a little standoffish, and they kind of directed them to the outer frontier areas to settle. Western Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire. And if you think about it, they were sent to the frontiers almost as a buffer against the Puritans and the Native Americans. And I found this is quite revealing. There was a small group of these Scots-Irish that did settle in Boston, and they actually built a church in Boston. And this is what the Puritans referred to this church as. They called this the Church of the Presbyterian Strangers. So you can get the thing that they were all Calvinists, but there's always been this long running rivalry between England and Scotland, if you've ever seen Braveheart, and also England and Ireland. So yeah, they were Puritans, they were Presbyterians, but they were still Scottish. That was the point. Now, if you go to this location today, this is 100 Federal Street in Boston. And this is where the Bank of Boston now stands. And here's a photograph of at least the bottom of it. I couldn't get the whole thing in, so I did that. Now, it's good news is the Church of the Presbyterian Strangers, although the building's not there anymore, the congregation still exists today. It exists as the Congregational Church, the First Congregational Church of Boston, which is located just off of where Boston Common is today. Here's a photograph. Well, we've got a small nugget of Irish in Boston, and immediately the struggle begins. We start to see problems. And here are some examples of what happened. The anti-Catholic law of 1647, the genesis of this was there were rumors swirling around Boston in 1647 that there was a Jesuit about, and he was holding mass in secret out in the woods and people's basements. And they decided that they would pass a law against the Catholics, against the Jesuits. Here's the actual language of the law, and I'll read it to you. Death to all and every Jesuit, seminary, priest, missionary, or spiritual or ecclesiastical person made or ordained by any authority, power, jurisdiction derived, challenged, or pretended from the Pope or the See of Rome. Whew. Translation, no Catholics. You can't have priests, you can't have a church. It's illegal. And one wonders, was there a Jesuit priest running around? Who knows? There's no, I have found no primary source to indicate that there was, but it's highly likely because there were some good number of Catholics in Boston at the time. And then there was the incident of Goody Glover, or Goodwife Glover. Goody Glover was in her 60s. She had been one of these people abducted off the streets of Ireland and brought into servitude, first down in the West Indies with her husband, and the legend is that he was murdered because he wouldn't give up his faith. And somehow she made it up here to New England with her daughters. She and her daughters worked for this gentleman in Boston, John Goodwin, who was a good Puritan. And they did his laundry, they kept his house. And one day, a fight broke out, it seems, that Goody Glover's daughters were accused of stealing laundry. Well, the daughters got into it with the daughters of John Goodwin, and then they went home and told Goody Glover. And she stormed over there and started giving them, you know what. And the next thing you knew, after that, John Goodwin's daughters started having fits, started saying that Goody Glover was coming to them at night and that she was a witch. Does this sound familiar? Yes, we're only a few years off from Salem. This was the template for Salem. These girls continued to accuse Goody Glover of being a witch, and she was brought before the magistrates. And this book you see here was the handbook on how to identify witches. And the first thing they do when they brought somebody in who was accused of being a witch was to put them to the test. And the test was to say the Lord's Prayer. Goodwife Glover was brought before the magistrates, and she kept talking back too. That was strike one. And then they asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer. And she did that. And she did it the only way she could do it, the only way she knew how to do it as a Catholic. She said it in Latin. Strike two. And that meant that she couldn't say the prayer technically. And then she talked back even more to the magistrates. Strike three. And she was convicted and sentenced to death for being a witch, just by the simple fact that she could not technically say the Lord's Prayer. And she was brought down to Boston Neck and hanged as a witch. Now, I've read accounts from some of the Puritans at the time, Judge Sewall, others, and their writings indicate they knew perfectly well what they were doing. They knew she wasn't a witch. This was just a convenient way to get rid of a mouthy old Irish woman. And that's what they did. Now, years ago, when I'd go down to the north end of Boston, which most people think of as the Italian enclave, I should say, oddly enough, I found an Irish restaurant in the north end. And guess what? It's not there anymore. It didn't last too long. It was called Goody Glover's Restaurant. And they had this actual plaque on the wall here. And if you read the plaque, it refers to her as the first Irish martyr in Boston. And when you leave, or when you left the restaurant, they had an artist rendering of what they thought she might have looked like. So let's go back to England. Well, did you know, in England, they have a holiday quite like our own 4th of July, except it's celebrated on November 5th. It's to celebrate the gunpowder plot. Now, you might be thinking, why would they celebrate a gunpowder plot? What is this? So the story here is that there were some disgruntled Catholics in England, and what they did was they conspired to blow up Parliament. They had actually secreted barrels of gunpowder into the basement of Parliament, and they were just waiting for when Parliament was in the session, hopefully with maybe even the king there, and they could blow the place sky high and kill all those people. Now, you might be thinking even further, why would the British celebrate this? Well, they celebrate the fact that the plot was foiled. And it was foiled because this man here, his name was Guy Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes, if you look at the original accounts, was caught. He was left to guard the gunpowder the day before they were going to ignite it. And the whole plot was foiled. Guy Fawkes was brought in, he was arrested. Here's a picture of them dragging him away from those barrels of powder. And he was brought here. And if you've ever been to London, you know what this is. This is London Tower. And this is where all manner of torture was done. And that was probably what was done to Guy Fawkes, because almost immediately he gave up all of his conspirators and Confederates. They were brought in, they were put on trial, and they were sentenced to death. And they were sentenced to death, and the charge was treason. Now, back in 17th century England, you did not want to be convicted of treason. It was the worst punishment. This was the worst crime imaginable to the people of England. And this is what your punishment would be. You would be drawn to the gallows, hanged within an inch of your life, and then tied to a table here, and then slit from stem to stern, and your innards would be removed, sometimes when people were conscious. This is called being hanged, drawn, and quartered, even though it's not in that right order. Quartering was the icing on the cake. Afterwards, they'd take you out and they'd do this. You would be literally quartered, and then your head would be taken and put on a pike on London Bridge. Now you might be saying to yourself, what does this have to do with the Irish in Boston? He's just being gratuitous. Well, no, actually, this holiday transferred over to New England. This holiday was brought here and it was celebrated here, only they didn't call it Guy Fawkes Day like they do in England. It was called Pope's Day over here in Boston. And here's a depiction of what would usually go on. On every November 5th, each neighborhood in Boston would construct an effigy of the Pope. And the game was that they'd bring it into neighboring neighborhoods or rival neighborhoods and try to get it through the neighborhood without the other neighborhood tearing their effigy apart. And at the end of the day, the neighborhood that had the effigy that was still somewhat intact won the day, and there was lots of drinking and carousing going on. And this was all in celebration of the gunpowder plot. Well, this was swiftly put to end, and it was put to an end by this man. And if you've ever been to the public gardens in Boston, you might know who this is. If you don't, you might want to look on your dollar bill or maybe think of Mount Rushmore. Yes, this is George Washington. Right after the evacuation of Boston, when the British were ejected from Boston after occupying it during the Revolutionary War, he saw this and he was utterly appalled because he knew that there were men in his army that were fighting, Irishmen that were fighting against the tyranny of Great Britain. And this was just another mark of the tyranny of Great Britain. In fact, it was an Irishman that brought those cannon to Dorchester Heights to surround Boston, Henry Knox, SCOTS-IRISH. Finally, as time goes on, things begin to cool down a little bit, and the Irish begin to emerge, so to say. Here are some firsts. Now, this is the location of the first Catholic Mass in Boston. And this was at the corner of School and Washington Street. If you're familiar with this area, this is where the Irish Famine Memorial is, where you'll see that in a little bit. And if you look at this, this is November 2nd, 1788 was the first time that they felt safe coming out in the open and having an actual mass. It was in an old Huguenot church that was abandoned. This, it should be noted also, this was the first Catholic mass, not only in Boston, but in all of New England. And they arrived in the 1650s, and it took them till 1788. The first cathedral in Boston was built in 1803. And if you go up to 47 Franklin Street, you'll find this. This is a somewhat of a plaque, I guess you could say, an engraving on the building that is at that location now. And this is the building. At one time, it was still part of the Catholic Church. It was, I think, a dormitory for St. John's Seminary. From what I found out now, it's been sold, and it's now the home to a Mexican restaurant if you'd like to go get some Mexican food. Here's another first. The first Catholic, Irish Catholic burial ground over in South Boston on Dorchester Ave, St. Augustine's. And it wasn't until 1818 that this was built. And that really, you might be wondering, where did they bury their dead? Because if you grew up Catholic, you're Catholic, you know you need to be buried in consecrated ground in a Catholic cemetery. And there have been burials found of Irish Catholics. They know by the artifacts found with the bodies. These were actually uncovered when they were doing street work, and it was found to be an old pauper's burial ground. But I was kind of befuddled. I was thinking, where could they be buried? The city of Boston actually fought the building of an Irish Catholic burial ground for years. My thinking is probably when they were buried, they had a priest sprinkle some holy water on the dirt, and that's probably how they did it. But it was till then. The first Irish Catholic newspaper was the Boston Pilot, which is still in effect today. Now, as they're starting to emerge, more Irish are coming to Boston. Now, a lot of people believe, they just think that all the Irish came after the potato famine, that there was a deluge of Irish. It actually started much earlier. And it didn't start as a deluge like in the potato famine. It was more of a trickle, but it added up. And this is why more Irish started coming to Boston and other cities within the United States. Great Britain started passing these laws, the penal laws, over a course of years. They didn't just do it all at once. But if you look at these penal laws, they were passed against the people of Ireland in their own homes. Look at this. You're forbidden to exercise your religion. You're forbidden to get an education, enter a profession, hold public office. You couldn't even own a horse greater than 5 pounds. You couldn't purchase land, vote. You couldn't even be guardian to a child or educate your own child. So if you look at this, essentially, the human rights of the Irish people are being slowly stripped away. And now, most of Ireland had been almost colonized. The people that were there, their land was taken over by English landlords, and a lot of that land was farmed. There were still some people who were Irish that still owned land, but these laws were passed against them. These are called the Enclosure Acts. And again, this is a series of laws that happen over a course of years, but this is somewhat of a summary. If you look at this, if you own land, if you were Irish and you own land, you couldn't carry out these activities. You couldn't plant. You couldn't cultivate your own land. You couldn't cut that. You couldn't even grow hay. You couldn't graze animals. If you had a pond on it, you couldn't fish. You couldn't even cut the trees down. What could you do with your land? You could sell it to an Englishman. And in the 1820s, a lot of people did that, and they got out and they came to America. And if you look at the population of Boston, you can see this growth. You can see this small group of Irish coming in. Now, by 1820, there was about 2,000 Irish. Just in 5 years, it grew by 3,000 people. And considering the amount of people in the city, that's a lot of people. And then by 1830, it jumped to 7,000 people. And if there's only 61,000 some odd people in Boston, that's a lot of Irish. It's not like when the potato famine hit, but you've got a lot of Irish. And now, again, you're starting to see more problems pop up. Here are some of the early conflicts that happened in the 1830s. Now, this is what I'm going to tell you about. There were many. I've focused on the ones that probably the most egregious, I guess. Now, this actually happened at the Ursuline Convent, Mount Benedict in Charlestown, which I know is not Boston, but it's just, a stone's throw across the Charles River. Today, if you want to find the site, it's actually Charlestown ceded part of the location to Somerville. So today it's in Somerville, actually. But back then it was in Charlestown. And this Ursuline Convent was a school for girls. And the nuns were the teachers. But it wasn't Catholic kids that went there, Catholic girls. It was the daughters of what they're being called Brahmins now, up on Beacon Hill, the Yankee Brahmins, the descendants of those Puritans. And they're going to this school because it was a first-class education. Now, some things happened here. This is kind of a wick that's being lit here. Here's the first thing. This is Rebecca Reed. She was of Yankee stock, not of the rich Beacon Hill Yankees, but she was of Yankee stock, and she was actually at the convent on a scholarship. And it said that she became enthralled with the learning and the religion, and she was on the verge of converting to Catholicism. She even expressed a desire to become a nun. She wanted to become a novice, which is kind of like a nun in training. And then for some reason, she just left. And then a while later, this manuscript is published. It's called 6 Months in a Convent. And it had all these stories about how girls were being tortured and chained to walls, and then being browbeaten into becoming Catholic and brainwashed, even though that term was in existence back then. And people got a hold of this. People read it. They started talking, what's going on up there? What are they doing? And then another incident happened that further caused more controversy. This is Sister Mary St. John. She was a music teacher at the convent, and an incident happened with her. She was teaching in August of all times. I'm a teacher. I don't know how they could teach in that heat. And she got really flustered with something or somebody in the class, and she threw down her baton and walked off. And she ended up in the parlor, the front parlor of one of the most prominent Puritan or Brahmin families over in Beacon Hill. I don't know how she ended up there or why. And she started to calm down. And eventually the Mother Superior, Sister Thomas, came over, and they had a talk, and they decided that she would just go back to the convent. By this time, she was embarrassed that her anger got her. Of course, she was Irish. So. And she just was brought back to the convent nicely. She thought she was going to be kicked out. Now, what got out to the general public was that this woman was dragged back to the convent, kicking and screaming. Now, this is the Mother Superior. I'm sorry, Sister Mary St. George. I think I said Thomas. And the talking and the gossip got to such a point that the Charlestown selectmen decided to make a call at the convent, and they knocked on that door and they demanded entry to the convent to inspect it. And Sister Mary St. George stuck her head up out of this window here and told them where to go. You can kind of get the feeling of her. She was one tough woman. And they went off in a huff. And the next thing you know, Bishop Fenwick is visiting Sister Mary St. George. And he's more of a politician. And he says to her, you better let them in. Just let them look around. There's nothing to hide. So this council or this contingent of selectmen came back. They toured the convent. They talked to the students. They looked around. They didn't see any chains on the walls. They talked to the students. They loved their teachers. They loved their learning. And there was nothing of the sort that Rebecca Reed was talking about, all these rumors. Now, the thing was, they were satisfied that nothing was wrong there, but they didn't go out and publish it. They didn't tell anybody. And the clicking and the talking kept going. And then this man came to town. This is the Reverend Lyman Beecher, who was a fire and brimstone Protestant minister. And he had come to Boston to preach 3 sermons. And he was actually pushing his book here that you see, which was a very anti-Catholic book. And in one of the sermons, he actually advocated the burning of the cathedral in Boston. And yes, you might be saying to yourself, is he related to Harriet Beecher Stowe? Yes, that's her father. So this is just fanning the flames in Boston. People are, this anti-Catholic, Irish Catholic sentiment is growing and growing and growing. And it came to an head when a group of workmen started to gather outside the convent. I think there had been some drinking going on, and they started going on about people being held captive in the convent. And before you knew it, a crowd of people started to gather. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger as the night wore on. And finally, they approached that door and they banged on the door. And Sister Mary St. George came out and gave them the wherewithal, just like she did with the selectmen. Big mistake. That door got kicked in and the mob came into the convent. Now, the nuns and the students went out the back door as the mob came in the front door. And it was bedlam. They went all throughout the convent. They were pilfering. They were looting. There's stories of pianos being thrown out the window. They were trying to get anything of value that they could. And then somebody lit a match. And the thing went up in flames. By the time the fire department got there, it was too late. They just stood there and watched. Now in the morning, the folks over on Beacon Hill, the Brahmins woke up and even they were appalled. They couldn't believe this had happened. The mayor and the governor got together and they heard rumors that this mob was going to reform probably in a day or two and go at the cathedral. So they decided to post militia outside the cathedral in Boston to guard the cathedral. And they were right. A mob did form. They headed towards the cathedral, but when they saw those bayonets and muskets, they decided to turn around and head back and pick over the convent, what was left over it. And it said that they went out and back to the graves of the nuns who were kept in these stone sarcophaguses, you could say, and they pushed over the rocks and they started to loot the bodies, taking out gold fillings out of their teeth. And this was the Boston that these Irish came to. Now today, many people have no idea what happened there. There is a monument. The monument's about a half mile away from the actual site. And if you want to look at this monument, it's on the grounds of the Somerville Public Library. But if you go about a half mile down the road, you'll come here to Mount Benedict. It's no longer a big hill anymore. It was leveled and houses were built all over the place. And, you know, I walk through the neighborhood and I look up in these windows and I wonder how many people actually knew what probably happened right here. Probably no one. There's not much evidence that it ever happened other than Benedict Street. There was a Mount Benedict here one day. Here's another incident that happened. It's called the Broad Street Riot. If you go to Broad Street today, it is the financial center of Boston, big high rises and everything. This was the first Irish ghetto. And if you can imagine what it looked like, it was probably all wooden tenements. There are very few buildings left from the 1830s. This is one that you're looking at. And it was on these streets that a major riot happened in Boston. Now, this riot started when a group of Irish were coming back from a wake, and they ran across a fire company, a Yankee fire company that were coming back from a fire. Somebody said something to somebody, and a huge melee broke out. And before you knew it, the buildings were emptied and everybody was out in the street battling with one another. And then the buildings started to be lit on fire. People were looting the buildings. There were people pummeling each other with whatever they could grab, a brick or a branch off of a tree. Oddly enough, nobody was killed. And after a day or two, it settled down and there were people arrested, both Yankee and Irish. The only people that went to jail were Irish. Well, this brings us to the deluge that I was talking about, the Great Hunger. Some people call it the potato famine. This potato famine needs a little bit of explaining. As I was a kid growing up, I would hear stories about the potato famine, and I would think, how come they just ate potatoes? What's this joking about Irish eating potatoes all the time? And it was a very real thing. And of course, it wasn't by choice. Most of these Irish had been relegated to tenant farmer status on the land of their ancestors, owned by English landlords who own these big farm estates. They shipped out anything that you can think of here. Here's a list of what was shipped out here. Crops, wheat, oats, barley, other commodities such as peas, beans, onions, anything you can think of was grown in Ireland. But it was grown, the labor that they used was the Irish. But the Irish were not eating this food because this was made for export. They were relegated to what they could plant on their own patch. And if you look here, here's the remnants of those patches. All those little squares at one time had a little cottage on them. And the potato was perfect because you could plant it in a small area and it would yield enough food that you could survive on for the rest of the year. And that's what they did. They became very, very resourceful at creating something interesting with potatoes every time they had a meal. But then the potato blight happened. And it was basically a fungus that rotted the potato. And these people, their food supply was gone. Now, when it first happened, there was a government that was a little bit responsive in England, and it was under the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. And they saw that people were starving. They couldn't work if they were starving, so they were trying to supplement their food until this blight was over. And they had soup kitchens, they had workhouses where they could go and work and try to get some food. And still people were dying. Then eventually the government in Britain changed under Lord John Russell. And this government they took a laissez-faire attitude. That means leave it alone. I guess it's kind of like the modern day conservatives who believe that the less government, the better. And also these people felt that it was the Irish, it was their own fault that this happened. So they pulled all of these supports out and more people started to die. And the British government said, it's not our problem, it's you landlords, you take care of it, it's on your property and you take care of it. And this is how they took care of it. When their tenants couldn't work anymore because of starvation, they couldn't pay their rent. So they were evicted. And many people were kicked out of their cottages like this depiction here. And they ended up in the woods, living in these things called skibberines, scrounging around for any kind of sustenance that they could find. Now, these lithographs that you're looking at were done by reporters on the scene during the potato blight. And if you can think of it as photojournalism, this is what it was. And these images were in papers all over the world. People knew what was going on and nothing was being done. Meanwhile, 4,000 vessels in 1 year, 4,000 vessels went out with food in the year 1847. Not to feed these people, but for export. And people began to die in the thousands. If you look at this, this really brings it home here. This is shocking. Let me blow it up a little bit. If you look closely, the boy looks like he's trying to eat his shoe leather. Dad's out trimming bark off the tree. Maybe you can eat bark if you boil it. I don't know. Is mom even alive? There's a baby is suckling on mom. Is she even alive? Shocking. And these images really tell it. They bring it home. I got to give the Boston Brahmins a little bit of credit here. They did load up a ship with food called the Jamestown and sent it over to Ireland to try to help. It was like a drop in the pan, though. And the bodies were just piling up. There's one story that I felt was really kind of shocking. There was a American who was in Ireland, touring Ireland, and he had an Irish host, and they were on a carriage going through the countryside, and he kept seeing just dead bodies on the side of the road. And he noticed something. He noticed that they all had green around their mouths. And he asked his host, he said, "How come they all have green around their mouth?" And he replied, "Oh, that's because they've been eating the grass. You can't eat the grass." There had to be a solution here. People were dying in droves. These are the statistics. 1 million people died. Between 1845 and 1855, nearly 2 million people emigrated from Ireland to America, Australia, and other places, South America. 25% of the population dropped. I don't think it's even ever gotten back to those numbers. And many people were able to get out, partially because some of these landlords were willing to pay the pittance to get them to America. And they paid a pittance because they came on these ships. This is what they looked like getting on those ships. That's statuary in Dublin. And these are the ships they got onto. They were cramped to the gills. And they called these ships coffin ships. And you can see why. You could spend up to 2 months on these stinkholes. People were getting on these ships. They were already sick. Diphtheria, typhoid, dysentery, and you can imagine what the stench was like on board. And I look at some of these images, and it brings me back to the days when I used to teach about the African slave trade in the Middle Passage and how they were packed like sardines. This isn't as bad as that, but it was similar in the fact that every morning on those ships, there were dead bodies that needed to be thrown overboard. But you can imagine the joy in their heart when they saw land. Some saw the dome of the State House coming in, and it wasn't really what they were expecting. I think America's reputation was a little gilded, to say the least. It wasn't the land of milk and honey, and the streets weren't paved in gold either. Some people had family here. They were welcomed with open arms, but most people were just dumped off into these slums. Boston being Boston had overcrowding. The image you're looking at right now is an image of the Irish in the 5 Points in New York City, which probably was the most wretched Irish ghetto of them all. They landed in these cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, St. John's, New Brunswick. and the populations of these cities were overwhelmed with the numbers. Boston, 1 year in Boston, during the potato famine, there were 37,000 new immigrants just to Boston. And this is how they came. And I love the statuary. If you ever get a chance in Boston, it's down on School in Washington Street. And this is how they arrived. And it's juxtaposed against this statue, which I know is supposedly the same family years later. But when I first saw it, I had a different take on it. I like how they're looking back. They're looking back, and it's almost, I like to look at it as the modern Irish family needs to look back where they came from. So they got here. What accommodations were available? Not much. There were several Irish enclaves, or ghettos as they were called back then, the Boston waterfront along the Battery March, Broad Street, as we just saw. The North End was an Irish ghetto before it was Italian. East Boston before it was Italian. Not South Boston yet. That didn't come till later when they got some money and they moved to the suburbs. So these are the areas where they moved, and this is an aerial photograph taken from a balloon in the 1850s, so you can kind of get an idea how cramped it was. It was mainly wooden tenants, and these people came to a city that was already overcrowded. They were crammed into sheds, barns, stables, low-ceiling garrets, basements that flooded under the most unsanitary conditions. For instance, here's a survey. One survey showed 67 toilets in 118 houses inhabited by 540 immigrants. 17 of those were out of order. One sink might serve a whole tenement building. One outhouse, a whole neighborhood. And the people came diseased, and they kept dying once they got here too. Now, this is what Boston probably looked like at the time. This is actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. This is the North End. I took this photograph while I was having a nice Italian meal over on Hanover Street. And my wife always says that I look at places and see what was there and what's not here now. And here's an example. This is an alleyway in the North End, and if you were to rent some of these apartments today, it's probably quite exorbitant. But back in the day, this is probably what was in that alley. People doing their laundry, crowded tenements, children running back and forth. At one point, Hanover Street probably looked like this. And here are some more streets. Now, some of the photographs I'm showing you, of course, are later in the 1800s, but it was still an Irish enclave by that time. And you can still see wooden tenement buildings. Those are probably in the 1870s or so, 1880s. So what work was available? Really not much. If you're a woman, you had two options. You could be a scrubber woman. That's the woman down on her hands and knees scrubbing floors. Or you could be a chambermaid, and that's somebody who took care of the house and cooked and cleaned. And mainly it was for the Brahmins up on Beacon Hill, and the Yankee families. That was pretty much all you had open to you if you're a woman. In most Irish families, the women had to work to support the family as well. Men, you had many more options. You could be a waiter. One occupation that was all full up was the barber occupation. From my research, I found that the African Americans had the corner on the barber market back then. And then you could work in a grocery. I guess it's the equivalent of 7-Eleven or Cumberland Farms today. Then, of course, you can work in one of those factories as long as they didn't have one of those no Irish need apply signs, which did exist. I know there's a lot of people out there saying they didn't. Consider this. Your job would be to work there probably 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, no breaks, no lunch. You were at your machine constantly because you were working piecework. If you stopped working that machine, you stopped making money. So you took your lunch, your smoke breaks right there in the most god-awful conditions. In the summer, it was boiling hot. They didn't have air conditioning back then. In the winter, it was cold and they had to shut the windows and there was a lot of filth flying around. But you know, it was better than starving to death. And here's what Boston looked like at the time, if you can imagine that. This is before the EPA, obviously. Now, as a male, you could work on the docks as a longshoreman or a stevedore. Everything that was put on those boats was done so on the back of Irishmen, and taken off, I should say, too. Here's what the waterfront looked like at that time, and here's what it looks like now. Or you could be the quintessential ditch digger, muckraker, blacklegs, they call them. And these men worked so hard. Some of them worked themselves to death. A lot of these guys were dead before they were 50. And some of the politicians that I'm going to tell you about in about a minute or so, there's a common thread here. Their fathers all died early. In Boston was literally, if you want, you could say this, literally built by the Irish. And it started here on Beacon Hill. They took the hill down to fill in the marshy areas of Boston. This map shows it brilliantly. This is what the Puritans had, and this is what the Irish did to it. In 1830, the Mill Pond area was filled in, and that was pretty much done with the soil from Beacon Hill and other surrounding hills. Other areas were filled in. And I often thought I'd be in Chinatown, which you think is the middle of the city, and there's a beach street in Chinatown. It once went to a beach. And of course, the West Cove, and then finally, what we call the Back Bay. It was a Back Bay because it was one big marsh. And now it's probably some of the most desired property in Boston. This was all done through Irish labor. So as you can imagine, with these large astronomical numbers coming into America, there must have been some kind of a backlash. This is where you can kind of sense history repeats itself. And there was a backlash. And it came in the form of a political party called the Know Nothing Party. They started out as a secret society. And they'd have meetings, and people would go to the meetings and they'd talk about what they were going to do. They never kept minutes, so it's really hard for historians. We don't know what they did. We know that if anybody left the meeting and somebody said, "Hey, what happened?" they were instructed to say, "We know nothing," kind of like Sergeant Schultz used to say. And eventually they morphed into what was called the Native American Party. And here's a little flyer that shows their platform. It's kind of a dichotomy. On one hand, they were against immigration. They were against Catholics, Irish, of course, and anything that was foreign. But then on the other hand, they were abolitionists and they were against slavery. Now, this political party, the Native American Party, fell apart before 10 years was over, and the abolitionist wing of that party eventually morphed into what we know as the modern day Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. Now, in Massachusetts, this took the effect of the Nativist Party was enormous. In the election of 1854, listen to this, this has never happened before or since. The election of 1854, the Native American Party swept every constitutional office, including the governor. seat of governor here. They won all 40 state Senate races, carried every U.S. constitutional district. Out of 381 seats up for election in the State House of Reps, they won 379. This is what you call a landslide. And here we have the first know-nothing governor. And I like to say he was the first of many, although he was the first official know-nothing party. Henry J. Gardner, in his inaugural address, he said the Irish Catholic influx was the greatest problem facing the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The Know Nothing Party had an agenda. This is what their agenda was. They wanted to have only the King James Bible read in public schools. They did do this. They banned the teaching of all foreign languages. They disbanded any Irish militia units. They proposed a constitutional amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution to forbid Roman Catholics from holding office in Massachusetts. This failed by a slim margin. Under the Pauper Removal Act that they sponsored, 1,300 Irish paupers were collected from asylums and they were shipped back to Ireland. They also formed the Joint Legislative Committee on the Inspection of Nunneries and Convents. And if you look at this cartoon from the time, this illustrates that. This is the committee in action. Here they are. They're in a nun cell. What have they found? They found a rosary. And my God, what was he found under the bed here? Ooh. I don't know if anybody's old enough to know what one of those is. That in the parlance of the day, the slang of the day, I should say, it was called a thunder jug. Speaking of cartoons in the newspaper, I'd like to share some with you. And this is one. As you can see, the people were complaining about the poorhouse from Galway coming over. And if you look at this one very, very closely, those are not alligators or crocodiles. Those are bishops in mitre hats landing on the shores of America, threatening the Native Americans with the Vatican looming in the distance here. And here we have a nice depiction of an Irish fellow. And actually, compared to what I'm going to show you, this is a nice picture. More commonly, this is how the Irish were depicted: as monkey-like, ne'er-do-wells, drunkards, living in a shanty, not doing any work, just laying around. And of course, they were brawlers. Even today, the Fighting Irish. And oh, God forbid that they got involved in politics, because you know who is controlling the Irish. And I believe they were saying that up until about 1960. Who's controlling the Irish Catholics, right? And I found this, I guess there was another group at the time that they didn't like too much either. But it looks like maybe they liked them more than the Irish. Oh. And who would you like as your nurse? Florence Nightingale or Bridget McBroser? And here is Lady Liberty grabbing that Irish scoundrel by the neck. This is the attitude of Americans toward the Irish coming in. And it wasn't pretty. And after a while, the Irish got a little fed up and they started to organize. And this is how it happened in Boston. And we started out with Patrick Maguire over here on the right. He came to Prince Edward Island as a young man, and at the age of 14, his family moved to Boston, became a printer's apprentice, and went into real estate and became very wealthy. He established the Republic, which was an Irish Catholic newspaper, and he had a goal. He had a goal to get Irish elected to local offices, whether it be lamplighter, or dog catcher, common council, maybe even the Board of Aldermen. And he was able to work with what we call the liberal Brahmins up on Beacon Hill. This is why I call this the age of cooperation. So some of these Brahmins wanted to help these Irish, and they were able to work with Patrick Maguire to do this. And then there was Patrick Collins. He was born in 1844 in Ireland, came over. His father died. He's another one. His father died as a young man, and in 1868, he became a state legislator. And he started something called the Young Men's Democratic Club. Now, this would be the model for the neighborhood, the ward boss office, I guess, without a better term to call it. And people would come to the Young Men's Democratic Club, and they knew this is where they could make connections in the city. They could get jobs. They could get housing if they needed even food. It was a self-help organization and a political organization. And then there was Hugh O'Brien in the middle here. He came to America in 1832, became a very successful businessman. And he was one of the first. Patrick Maguire's dream was to get somebody elected to the Board of Aldermen. 1875, he got elected to the Board of Aldermen. And then eventually, with the cooperation of those Boston Brahmins, he was elected the first Irish Catholic mayor in Boston. And then Patrick Collins later would become the second Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. Now, as these men were doing their magic, I guess, in Boston, they influenced other people in Boston to do the same thing. And probably the model of the Boston ward boss was this man, Martin Lemansky. They called him the Boston Mahatma, because if you came to his place, which was over on the West End, this is it, called the Hendricks Club. If you needed anything, if you needed a job, you needed housing, you needed schooling, anything you needed, you came to Lemansky. But it wasn't free. He asked one thing of the people that he helped, and that was to vote the way he asked them to. And the West End as a whole voted as a bloc. It was very, very powerful. Now, here are some men that kind of studied at the knee of Martin Lemansky, you might say. Here's a young man who was from the north end of Boston, and they called him Johnny Fitz. He eventually would become the ward boss over there. And this is interesting. I came across this story. He was with his men. They were kibitzing, they're talking, and there was a reporter just out of earshot trying to hear what they were saying. And he heard Johnny Fitz, but what he heard was not Johnny Fitz, he heard Honey Fitz. And the name Honey Fitz stuck. And over in East Boston, there was P.J. Kennedy. He owned a couple saloons over there, and that's where the politics happens. Did a lot of favors. He became a state senator and a ward boss as well. And then later on, this man emerged. This is James Michael Curley. And he was in the south end of Boston, not Southie, but the south end of Boston. And he became very prominent as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these men, just a little bit here. Now, obviously, you've heard the name Fitzgerald and Kennedy. You know where this is going. And when we think of the Kennedys, we think of Hyannis in Palm Springs or Palm Beach. And that is not where they came from. The building you're looking at is just off of North Square. This is 4 Garden Court. It's a tenement building. This is where Honey Fitz had to raise his family. When he lived in another spot in the North End, when his father died, he had to take care of his family, first of all. And then when he got married, he lived here. This is where Rose Kennedy was born, in this building here. And if you look at it, it looks like that door hasn't been painted since Honey Fitz lived there. And then there was P.J. Kennedy. And he, as you know, he was over in East Boston, and the two families got together. Here they are, P.J. Kennedy and Honey Fitz. Honey Fitz with his daughter Rose, and here's Joe Kennedy. And you know the result of that. That's P.J. Kennedy with his grandson. I think you know who that fellow is there. Wow. And James Michael Curley, what's his history? He's another one whose father died early. His father was one of these men working, I guess, on the road crew, and he was a big hulking man. And oftentimes the men on his crew would challenge him to do feats of strength. And they asked him to go over and lift up this big boulder, and he went over and he started to lift it, and he had a brain aneurysm and died on the spot. Well, he left a widow and two sons, James Michael Curley, his brother, and his mother. And they lived on Northampton Street, which is in back of the area where City Hospital is today, or I should say UMass Boston Hospital. Now, I tracked down the address of where they lived, and it was not this tenement, but it probably was right next to that tenement. You can see where the building was attached to it. And at a young age, eighth grade, James Michael Curley had to give up school and go to work. He went to work as a drug clerk. And many people would tell him that he had the gift of gab, you know, and he was a smart guy. He was self-taught. He knew Shakespeare verbatim, pretty good for an 8th grade dropout. And he began to take this to heart. People said, why don't you run for office? And he did that. He eventually got elected as a city councilman. And he had his own political club, the Tammany Club, which was over on Hampden Street in the South End. And you can see here it is during the Alfred Smith era in the 1930s. And he learned well from Lemansky. If you needed anything, you went to Curley, and Curley helped you out. And that's what got him in trouble. Early on, he got into trouble. He was a city councilman. And a constituent came to him and said, oh, James Michael, I flunked the postal exam. And Curley said to him, why? Oh, I couldn't spell Constantinople. So he said, I'll fix that. He was the master fixer. And this is what he did. The next time the exam came up, Curley passed himself off as this constituent, took the test and passed it. But he got caught. He got thrown in jail. And you would think that would be the end of his political career. Well, 4 times as mayor, 1 time as governor, and 1 time as congressman, I don't think it hurt him one bit, because that would dog him for the rest of his life. People would always say, weren't you thrown in jail for fraud? And he'd always say the same thing. He'd say, I did it for a friend. And that solidified him with his constituents, because they knew this man was willing to stick out his neck for them, and got elected time and time and time again. James Michael Curley. And this is the location of where that political club was. So Mayor Collins is serving his 2nd term, and he dies mid-office. Martin Lemansky has a man lined up ready to go in, and his former protege decides to go against him and run for mayor. And that protege is young Honey Fitzgerald from the North End. Here's his political club, the Jefferson Club. By now, he's the ward boss, and he wants to be the mayor. This is over on Chandler Street. It's still there if you want to go and visit it. Now, Honey Fitz ran on the ticket. His saying was, I want to build a bigger, better, busier Boston, because Boston was in an economic recession. And he did that. He had connections. He brought people into Boston. Things got a lot better. But since he went against Lemansky, he was also going against the establishment on Beacon Hill too. He made some enemies. And a group of Brahmins got together, and they called themselves the Good Government Association. Curley would call them the Goo-Goos. And they went after him, accusing him of bribery, nepotism, you name it. And he didn't get elected the 2nd time. And this is where he served as mayor. Luckily, this building is still with us. It's down on School Street. This is the former City Hall. It was saved in the 1950s. It was going to be torn down. And this is what replaced it. I'm not a fan of brutalist architecture. That's what they call that. That's very aptly named. Anyway. Honeyfitz loved being mayor. He did get elected one more time. He served 2 terms, as you can see here. Here he is throwing out the first pitch. And here he is years later in Palm Beach. And what a dynamo of a man. He was just had so much energy, had a great sense of humor. And I think Jack Kennedy got a lot of his charisma probably from Honeyfitz. And if you want to visit Honeyfitz, he's over at St. Joseph's in West Roxbury. Here's his gravestone. And oh, there was another memorial to Honeyfitz, the John Fitzgerald Expressway. How many people remember sitting in traffic on this thing? Obviously, we now know it's no longer there. It's been replaced by the tunnel, and the area is now the Rose Kennedy Greenway. Well, let's talk about the election of 1913. Honeyfitz wanted to run again, and he ran against his opponent, James Michael Curley. Now, the early straw polls were saying that Honeyfitz was way in the lead. Curley was just this unknown councilman who spent some time in jail. Nobody really knew who he was. And Honeyfitz, like I said, he was a ball of energy. During campaigns, he'd go to any meeting that was going on. He'd pop in, he'd glad hand people, he'd pop out. When he was on the streets of Boston, he'd see his people, and he'd call them his dearos. He'd scream, "My dearos." And there's stories of him going to wakes and shaking everybody's hand and then running out of the place, and the widow would be saying, "I didn't know my husband knew Honeyfitz," and he didn't. And every night at the end of the campaign day, he would go to this certain roadhouse and usually entertain people with his song, Sweet Adeline. He loved to sing Sweet Adeline. And by the way, he was a teetotaler, he didn't drink. And he liked to have a little dance with a young cigarette girl whose name was Toodles Ryan. Well, it was innocent enough. He liked to dance with her. And one night he was on the dance floor with Toodles Ryan, and he gave her a peck on the cheek. The thing was, one of Curley's men was at the roadhouse and witnessed this. And before you knew it, there was a letter that arrived at Honeyfitz's house outlining this whole horrible philandering. And Honeyfitz came home, and his wife was sitting on the steps with Rose next to her with that letter in her hand, slapping it on her hand. Kind of like a Ricky Ricardo moment. You got some explaining to do. And they said he had the gift of blarney. He must have. He talked himself out of that one. He explained to her that, look, it was an innocent thing. I danced with this Toodles. I gave her a little peck on the cheek. It was nothing. That Curley, he's a dirty scoundrel. He's trying to get me to drop out of the race. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. He didn't drop out of the race. So Curley is sitting back waiting for this to happen, and he's watching the papers, and no forfeiture of the office or anything. So he goes to Plan B. Curley goes to Plan B, and he decides to publish in the paper that he's doing a series of lectures, 2 lectures in fact. One lecture was Great Lovers in History, Cleopatra to Toodles. And the other one was Great Libertines in History, Henry VIII to present. Now, Honeyfitz saw the writing on the wall. He didn't believe this guy would get down and dirty like that. Some people called Curley the first modern politician. So he dropped out of the race. And almost by default, James Michael Curley became the fourth Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. And here you see him, looks like somewhat of a gangster almost. And I was fascinated by Curly doing this lecture, and I'm going to end off here. This is Curly. I would be reading about him, and I'd see what some good things that he really did. And then a couple pages later, I'd turn the page and see about some of the horrible things that he did. And I thought, what a great guy. And then I'd be, what a horrible man. And this part of the ending part of the lecture, I'm going to call the good, the bad, and the Curly. Let me tell you about the good Curly. He really had a soft spot for the poor people. His club, the Tammany Club, gave food to families. They had Christmas dinners. They helped homeless. They helped those who were out in the cold. As a politician, he used his influence to build hospitals, to get people jobs. One of the stories that really touched me was when he took office. His first day in office in that beautiful building you just saw, the City Hall, he kind of made an edict. He said, give all the scrubber women mops. You might be thinking to yourself, wow, what's so great about that? His mother was a scrubber woman, and he knew it was a life on your hands and knees scrubbing floors. And what he did was he gave those women dignity. Another story that I came across was told by his chauffeur. And his chauffeur told of how he would often work till late at night, and sometimes he'd come out at night and there'd be this drunk called Mike staggering around outside the City Hall. And Curly sometimes would go up to him and give him a sawbuck and say, hey, Mike, here's the money I owe you. And there weren't cameras flashing, there weren't reporters standing around. Nobody knew this until he died. That's the good Curly. And then there was the bad Curly. And I think this personifies the bad Curly. He bought this the first year as he was a mayor. And he did not have the money, anywhere near the money to buy this big mansion. Later, he would claim that, I made investments with this plumber whose name was Daley of all things. And pretty soon people were accusing him of bribery and graft, and it was all true. Now, he had a little tactic. If an editor decided to accuse him of bribery or graft or doing something illegal, he would just sue him and they'd go away. So another story of him was one of these editors that actually was writing bad stories about him. His name was Enright. Came across Curly one day. He was walking down Washington Street and they crossed paths. So they almost crossed paths because Curly wound up and socked him in the jaw. And Enright said, I came to and I looked up and there he was standing over me, hurling invectives at me. There's another incident when he came into WBZ and a political opponent surrogate was on the radio bad-mouthing him. He went into the booth and pummeled him. Can you imagine Marty Walsh or Mayor Menino doing something like this? No, he stayed in office too. And then finally, during his fifth term in office, we're getting there. This is in the 1930s. So he tried to sidle up to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt found out pretty quickly what he was. His last term in office, he was seeing the end of the tunnel. He wanted to retire. And it's said by this time he had 2 giant safes in his house full of cash, but he needed to invest this money. So he was looking around and he came across this group in Nevada that claimed to have a silver mine. And he went out there and they showed him the silver mine. They took him into a tunnel and hey, look at the silver. What he didn't know was they stuck pieces of silver in the dirt and he sunk all of his money into this thing. And then these con men started to use in his name to peddle influence with bribing senators and congressmen down in Washington, D.C. And this all fell apart. He was actually involved in this when it came down. The federal prosecutors came after him, and he was tried and he was convicted on federal charges of fraud, taken out of his office, his mayor's office, and put federal prison down in Danbury, Connecticut. And he was still the mayor. Now, every politician in New England, this is in the late 1940s, every politician in New England signed this petition to get him out, except for one. A young congressman who was a PT boat captain, newly out of World War II. Can you name him? Yeah, I think you can. Well, he finally he went back to office and he finished out his 4th term. He did run for a 5th term unsuccessfully. Here he is, 5, get it? After that, he became kind of a sad figure, hanging around the State House, trying to muster up odd jobs because he was dead broke. And in the interim, several of his children died, which he thought was punishment from God for his dirty dealings. So there's one story that comes to us from Tip O'Neill, who was a young congressman at the time. And Curley approached him and asked him if there was anything he could have him do. And Tip said, yeah, you can use your connections and maybe get some donors for my campaign. And Curley said, that's great, I'll do that. And he did that. But these donors, after a while, these donors started to come to Tip O'Neill and saying things like, I thought I gave you 15,000. Where's the rest of it? And it was old Curley back to his skimming. Well, I guess he would have went out on a bad note, but he didn't, because this book came out. The Last Hurrah was written by local author Edwin O'Connor. It was a smash. It was a bestseller. The thing was, it was based entirely on the life of James Michael Curley, although it was fiction. The mayor in this case, in the book, his name was Mayor Skeffington. And Edwin O'Connor didn't know Curley, but he was deathly afraid of running into him on the street because he knew his reputation and didn't think that he would take this very well. Well, one day he was near the State House. O'Connor got out of his car and he sees James Michael Curley coming down the steps straight for him. And he's ready to get in on the chin. And next thing you know, Curley grabs his hand and shakes his hand and said, I love the book, especially the part where I die. Well, he took this one and ran with it. Curley started lecturing around New England, talking about himself as Mayor Skeffington. Now, it got even bigger, and another Irishman played Mayor Skeffington in the movie The Last Hurrah, and that was Spencer Tracy. Well, in the early 50s, I believe 54, Curley passed away. And if you I'm sorry, 58. If you were to look at his gravestone, it's like a resume here. But the one thing that I think he cherished the most, if you look at all these things here, was the one on the bottom, the mayor of the poor. Now, when he passed away, he was laid in state under the rotunda in the State House, and the line went up and down Beacon Street. Now, today, if you'd like to go and chat with Mayor Curley, he's over by Quincy Market. I don't know if this is the bad Curley or the good Curley, but anyway, this is someplace I bring my students, and or I have brought my students, and they'll sit down, they'll rub his belly, they'll sit in his lap, and I'll say to them, I'll say, do you know who that is? And of course they'll go, no. And I'll say, well, look on that thing that's attached to your hand, that cell phone thing. Look him up. That's James Michael Curley. Well, folks, in closing tonight, I'd like to say that these people, the Irish, they came to America's shores as servants, as prisoners, as half-dead, starving refugees. They endured ethnic and religious persecution and bigotry. They endured squalid, wretched poverty. They endured backbreaking menial labor. But in the end, they overcame, they surmounted, and they prevailed. And thank you for having me speak at your organization.
Wow, Chris, thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry it ran a little long, about 10 minutes. If there are any questions, I'd love to field those if people have anything to say or in the chat.
That's great. You know what? I am going to stop the recording. So if people
Okay.
would just like to unmute themselves and ask questions, so you won't have to fear being on camera at all. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you everyone for joining us at home.